only completed the beginning. We leave you much that is undone. There are great ideas undiscovered, breakthroughs available to those who can remove one of truth's protective layers.
Psychobiological analysis is a bit tricky to pin down, but that's a discussion for another day. Hello, denizens of this derelict space rock. Today we're going to be talking about Space Bros, which, if you haven't heard about it, is an indie show directed by Aiden Ditre that kind of explores the lives of four curious little critters. I tried to say both of those at the same time, and that didn't really work out. So we're going to try that again. Curious little critters that explore space. And it's just a very funny little character thing. And I'm going to kind of analyze that today. I'm going to analyze the plot, the people, the pacing, and the plan. So without any further ado, that doesn't make sense. Without further ado, let's jump into it.
It's okay to leave your dog in a hot car. It's okay to leave your dog in a...
If you're watching this, I don't think the current state of modern indie animation really needs an introduction, but I'm going to give you one anyways because I'm evil. The industry become what I like to call a new wave counter-establishment of just pure cultural force kind of permeating itself into every corner of our current zeitgeist. It just means it's everywhere. It's at GameStop, it's at the mall, it's at your stores, it's everywhere. And that itself is already a weird thing to say because usually when you think of the word indie, you imagine it being kind of small scale, homemade, having like a crust to it. Like a pizza, on the dough, and you roll it up, and it's all pizza-y, and it's all doughy and stuff. You imagine it's made by a very kind of indie type creator, right? The small scale independent creator. And that type of indie does still exist, but I wouldn't say it's as common or at least as visible as it was in maybe the early 2000s, earlier 2010s. This thing we call indie animation has accrued into a kind of monolithic mass of thing, which has, in this like weird inversive way, become the thing that now constitutes one of the most visible parts of the internet. And if you're young enough, or if you're old enough, or if you've actually even given it more than a moment of thought, the entire phenomenon likely won't strike you as novel at all. Of course, indie animation is a huge thing now. Of course, there are creator worlds with fandoms the size of small nations, merch pipelines, conventions, dubbing ecosystems, lore channels, and wikis more extensive than the Bible. And this condition didn't come from nowhere. It was built up 3 years of tumultuous work and a subcultural economy of individuals who weren't just going to wait around and would rather do their own thing than wait for permission to put pen to paper. I'm not the biggest expert on indie animation. I was very young, but a lot of this stuff was happening, so I don't remember a lot of it, but I did some research and I kind of found some things that I kind of remembered. Before indie animation became what it is today, it occupied a much smaller kind of niche back in the day. Newgrounds, for example, functioned as a kind of weird town square. Anyone could upload really whatever they wanted. This created a kind of weird condition at the time where basically people could just upload just about anything, even if it wasn't fully polished, and they could be tested in public without having to go through some kind of studio. On a broader scale, you had your more Birkin types like the Jungle Apes and the Guys of this world, and a plethora of smaller pilots, many others. And the ones that kind of rose to the top are the ones that are kind of around today and are their own small little media ecosystems like Hazbin Hotel, Murder Drones, Digital Circus, other ones I can't think of right now for some reason, but I swear they exist. There's a lot of them, and there's a lot of audience for them. I'll talk more a little bit later on in the video about what I think the current landscape has kind of evolved into, but for now, just keep in mind the current scale of internet animation in 2026. Now, here's where Space Bros comes in. I don't have a better segue. Saying Space Bros is a fascinating show is like touching the clouds above an iceberg and then saying you've seen the full iceberg, that you've seen it in all its totality, that you've somehow fully mastered and voyaged the deepest extent of its dark blue Poseidon depths. Or something, I don't know. Just kind of looking at it, the show seems to be the kind of thing a casual stroller would probably dismiss after 15 seconds. Comedy web series about a bunch of weirdos in space, but, almost every work of culture has, at one point or another, been vulnerable to that kind of first impression. I mean, Van Gogh's artwork only grew world-renowned after his death, after all. So, directed by Aiden Ditre, it follows the aforementioned group of weirdos, Clarkson, Star, Mark, and Ava, as they journey through the cosmos on the ultimate quest of Jungian self-actualization. What made the show immediately stand out to me from 1,000 other quirky internet cartoon shows was the fact that it didn't really feel like a assortment of gags floating in an aesthetic vacuum. But more on that in the next section. So, without any further ado, let's jump into it. Trying to condense Space Bros into a plot synopsis is about as useful as saying the Odyssey is an epic about going places. That's technically true, it doesn't actually sell the depth of the narrative to anyone. Again, I'll try my best to actually explain what's going on and what I interpret it to mean. Right off the bat, the pilot opens with a warning about cringe animation and bad mic quality. Now right off the bat here, there's several layers to this already. Obviously it's self-deprecation, but more specifically what it's doing is setting the entire tone of the work going forward. It's establishing the fact that the work won't take itself too seriously too early before it's narratively earned the gravity of that weight. We arrive to a world in which the species are already in crisis. They're sort of bickering amongst each other with vampires swarming their ship. Clarkson, the lime one, forgot his plot convenience ray, and all seems lost. Ava is there as well, doing their thing. Dr. Fizzle calls in with his horrific chipmunk voice, reveal he is the one truly running the show. And other things also happen. Episode 2, the phone call, is probably the purest expression of the show's gift of batshit insanity. Star calls Mark and explains that everything is simultaneously somehow flooded and on fire at the same time. Clarkson also ate a skull and now he's possessed. Construction was not an unfortunate accident so much as it was the natural conclusion of collective decision-making, which made it kind of inevitable that something like this would happen. Episode 3, The Equation, starts with serious socio-political and material analysis, laying out a resource conflict between two planets, only to immediately descend into conversational nonsense and the immortal question of whether Dr. Fizzle's wife is in fact a guitar. Christmas sniping takes what would be a normal seasonal special in literally any other show and turns it completely on its head, which is to say that Clarkson genuinely holds the belief that if one kills Santa Claus, one may inherit Santahood by right of violent secession. What unifies all the episodes, in my opinion, is that none of them feel like arbitrary detours, even though on paper they absolutely should feel like that. The show, or at least season 1 so far, is not really about one set event or myth arc, and rather largely exists as a much more character-focused experience overall, although the individual plots are still always of very high quality. One episode can be about murdering Santa, and another can be about interplanetary relations and a high-stakes resource war, and yet nothing feels out of place. There's a kind of internal consistency to it that lends itself to the sporadic format. The species still remain themselves, and the world is held together by a recurring social ontology. The show is not random in some kind of lazy sense. Events are absurd, but they're absurd in ways that emerge from the personalities of the species, rather than being stapled on from the outside. The creators understand that a plot can serve as a tool of pretext by which the temperament of the story can reveal itself over time. Space Bros is framed as a series about the friendliest friends who kind of hate each other, which is a surprisingly precise summation of its social ontology. The characters show a kind of enduring on-screen friction. And speaking of the characters are where things become, to use the scientific term, extremely epic, with each character representing a specific Jungian psychological archetype. This is objectively the truth, and if you don't believe me, I will send this man to your house, and he's not going to do anything. Like, he's not going to hurt you. He's just going to kind of look at you for a little bit, and then he's going to leave. Clarkson is the closest the show has to a protagonist in my humble opinion. Weird events tend to kind of just coalesce around him. He probably sits nearest to the trickster, a kind of destabilizing agent who breaks the current order and forces visibility. He's funny because he lacks what we might call behavioral inhibition. He doesn't pass through the usual human filters before acting or speaking, although he does have the capacity to make plans. In ensemble writing, this kind of character is often very useful and serves an actual structural purpose. Mark, to me, reads as the group's kind of regulatory principle. Mark resembles a person in a dysfunctional unit who has become overdeveloped in executive function and containment. But he also has a sense of humor, and he's not a boring straight man. And that, to me, is a sign of very good writing. Star, to my reading, seems to be the group's point of exposure. They have a kind of permeability about them, and they're kind of the character through which the friction mentioned earlier becomes very legible. Any other show would flatten him into the sad, angry one, but this show is smarter than that. Star matters because he has both comic function and a weird little sense of vulnerability that keeps him from becoming one note. Star, to me, is one of the main reasons the group actually feels like a cohesive unit instead of a set of disconnected punchlines. Ava reads to me as a kind of pre-procedural feral child. Generally, she seems kind of like the person who doesn't move through ordinary channels of social restraint, more like someone who processes the world in immediate, unfiltered bursts. I think she's a lot like Clarkson in this way, although still a different angle of the shadow. She has a gleeful volatility about her, a detail that becomes much more interesting when you realize her personality core has actually been damaged in such a way as to permanently suspend her at the mental age of 18. That detail gives the character a much stronger psychological contour, in my opinion. Her instability is not a joke or a random chaos trait packed onto the ensemble for some kind of quirky and comedic effect. It actually suggests a person caught in a kind of arrested psychic state, with all the emotional impulsiveness and identity exploration that accompanies late adolescence, without a normal process to mature past it, other than the people around her. The other species, knowingly or not, are the first context in which that damaged and volatile temperament can actually be understood and integrated into a group setting instead of being feared. Overall, I think the characters make for an extremely entertaining ensemble, full of all kinds of intrinsic peculiarities, and characters in shows are often what people remember long after the last episode airs. So, again, props to the people who made this for making memorable characters. One of the easiest mistakes people make when evaluating internet comedy is confusing speed for pacing. Something can be very, very fast and still be absolutely shapeless. It can be loud, dense, while still having no internal rhythm. Pacing implies intervals with peaks and dips. Space Bros understands this distinction far better than its self-effacing packaging initially lets on. There is no lumbering runaway, no 20-minute prologue explaining the universe. The show starts in medias res because it understands that social confusion is an engine for comedy. You learn who these people are not through the show literally telling you, through seeing how they behave under stress. Another thing the show understands about pacing is the value of narrative compression without losing the emotion. I see that a lot of short-form internet comedy can move quickly, but in doing so, it flattens everything into the same tonal register to where every joke lands with roughly the same weight and every character reaction begins to feel interchangeable. However, Space Bros does something more disciplined than that. It compresses event, not reaction. What that means is that the actual situations are thrown at you at a rapid pace, but the show still finds time for tiny beats of irritation, resignation, or casual cruelty that keep the rhythm from becoming monotonous. It works through these very well done tonal pivots that I feel like they have a consistent shape instead of being meaningless sequences of random things. Space Bros exist inside of a cultural moment in indie animation that is pretty odd. things that began as indie have now expanded to the point where they're effectively major franchises that still wear the skin of being indie. They retain the aura of outsider authenticity while operating with fan economies, platform partnerships, and merch economies that place them far beyond the original meaning of the term. The word indie has kind of ceased to name a size and has begun naming a form of presentation. Has-Been Hotel is a Prime Video series now. The Amazing Digital Circus exists simultaneously as a web series and a Netflix title. The Field has, for lack of a better term, stratified greatly. When fields stratify like this, smaller works often get hard to see, especially if they're not already attached to some mass animator brand or network with pre-existing social gravity. One no longer competes only with the old studios, now compete with the successful descendants of the original rebellion. The revolution grows old. And this is precisely why Space Bros interest me so much. It feels like a reminder of a more volatile time, a more crazy layer of the ecosystem. Not pre-professional in the dismissive sense, but pre-consolidated. Isn't entombed by the surrounding discourse yet. Still feels like a show that has to arrive on its own merits. People come to inherit not only opinions, but aesthetic allegiances, prestige structures, moral rankings, and complete symbolic packages that can no longer disentangle from the self. You can't simply just like a show anymore. You have to inherit a total relation to what liking it even fucking means. And so the indie animation world, for all its emancipatory promises, can still develop its own reflexes. This creator is good. That show is problematic. This style is authentic. That one is SoulCal. Similar works are often not judged in some pure open field of rational artistic consideration, but instead pre-assembled constellations of reputation and affiliation. What this often means is that visibility is never distributed evenly. Some works enter the conversation already cushioned by audience gravity, creator adjacency, or the vague but powerful sense that they're the sort of thing one is already supposed to care about. Others arrive with no such insulation. They have to generate their own legitimacy in real time, often in the shadow of louder and more institutionally affirmed projects. And once you start to notice that, the question ceases to be merely which shows are good and becomes something slightly more interesting. I mean, what exactly is an underdog? Is it merely the smaller show? Not exactly, in my opinion. The underdog is the work that has not yet been granted a kind of stabilizing inevitability, the work that still feels contingent, the work that has not been retroactively declared important, that must survive without the blessings bestowed upon the rest. And it is in that way that Space Bros becomes unexpectedly moving to me. The show's own internal ethos is one of dysfunctional perseverance. These characters are not sleek icons. They are, in the pilot's own phrasing, pieces of trash who nonetheless persist in acting, arguing, improvising, and remaining in relation. And that mirrors the condition of actual independent art. Not the polished poster for independent art, but the real thing, built in the middle of life by people whose means and ambitions and technical conditions don't always neatly align, but who continue on anyways. The world is a looking glass, and gives back to every man the reflection of his own face. And one of the more peculiar things about the internet is that it intensifies this process until culture itself becomes a hall of mirrored preferences. But this is precisely why small shows matter, because civilization depends upon reserving spaces where unfinished voices can still become themselves in public, where show can be strange, rough, and still not yet institutionally corrode, where someone can still make something with friends and throw it out to the world to see if it sticks. What dies first in any overcodified culture is not talent, but permission. The permission to be embryonic. The great lie of mature cultural systems is that legitimacy arrives only once the seams have been hidden. But that's just not how living art has ever actually worked. The cave wall came before the gallery. Men scratched gauze into stone with crude hands long before marble learned to imitate flesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh was pressed into clay before literature even fucking existed as a category. The cathedral masons left protests on the margins, copied monsters into the corners of holy books, because the sacred and the strange have always, at some subterranean level, been in tandem with one and the other. The most human works arrive existing just to dare to exist at all. For man is a recursive animal. He builds worlds and he builds institutions to stabilize those worlds, counter worlds to flee those institutions, and then inevitably begins institutionalizing the counter worlds in return. The avant-garde gets plastered in the museum. One is reminded of Diogenes living in his barrel while Plato drafted ideal forms, or of William Blake engraving visions no academy could fully metabolize, or of Henry Darger constructing an entire cosmos in private, or of the early internet itself, when every website looked like clown vomit and therefore a lot more alive. The rough and the marginal matter. They always have mattered. They're not always the better work, often they are not, but they remain closer to the source where form is still warm from the hand. We're a strange little show, made by a few little friends, that still feel less like a product being unveiled, and more like a genuine work of art. And that, to me, is the spirit of indie, and in turn, the spirit of Space Bros. And cut.